Some of the farming practices we use today in Puerto Rico were inherited from our indigenous ancestors, and we still eat some of the crops they used to grow. But one thing that has changed in a major way is that we no longer grow most of the food we eat here. And I found this place in Caguas that tells a big chunk of the story of why that happened. Because in the same place where we found petroglyphs and the bones of an indigenous woman is the same place where you can still see the ruins of a sugar plantation and the building where slaves used to sleep. That's the Botanical and Cultural Garden in the town of Caguas. Caguas, by the way, was named after an indigenous chief whose name was Caguax. So that town has a rich indigenous history. And there was something special about seeing the signs that our indigenous ancestors were there and imagining their lives fishing, hunting, and growing food by the river. The archaeologist who found the skeleton believes it was an indigenous woman between the ages of 18 and 20, and that she was buried in the fetal position because the natives believed that Earth was Mother Nature. So being buried was like going back to the womb. Now, this is a story about agriculture, but the reason I'm telling you this is because it speaks to the great respect that our indigenous ancestors had for nature. And some of the people I interviewed for this story say that we have to restore that respect for nature if we want to feed ourselves again. I'll get into that in a bit, but first I want to tell you and show you some of the crops that our indigenous ancestors used to grow on this land. Their main crop was yuca, and they used it to make a bread called casabe. They also grew batata, which is a kind of sweet potato. They're both delicious, by the way, and we eat them all the time. I just had them like 3 times this past week. But if you go to the supermarket like I did, you'll find that the ones on the shelves were not grown here. This yuca is from Costa Rica, and this batata is from Dominican Republic. And just like that, most of the produce on the shelves in the supermarket are not from here. Puerto Rico imports about 85% of the food we consume. And that's a big problem for several reasons. First, as you know, Puerto Rico is vulnerable to natural disasters. After Hurricane Maria, infrastructure was so destroyed that ships could not dock and access to roads was cut off. So there was no food delivery to supermarkets, and some of them were closed for weeks or months. And those that did open had long lines and empty shelves. But even with the damage that the hurricane caused to agriculture, people who had farms had their own crops that they could eat, while the rest had to wait for outside help. Number 2, there's something called the Jones Act. That's a law that forces Puerto Rico to use U.S. ships when importing something from the rest of the United States. The problem is that U.S. ships are a lot more expensive than ships from other countries, but Puerto Rico doesn't have a choice. They have to use those U.S. ships. The New York Fed found that it's about twice as expensive to import something from the U.S. to Puerto Rico than it is to import something from the U.S. to Dominican Republic. And of course, it's Puerto Ricans who pay for that. That's why there's higher prices for things like food. And it's not even high quality food because it takes so long to get here. And lastly, it's just not sustainable. Think about all the emissions that are released when transporting something from so far away. Because of these reasons, there are some young Puerto Ricans returning to the land and pushing for food sovereignty. I'm going to introduce you to 2 of them. But first, let's talk about how we got here. How did we go from the ways of our indigenous ancestors who grew what they ate to now depending so heavily on imports from other countries? Well, in one word, colonization. When the colonizers got here at the end of the 15th century, they were looking for ways to extract wealth and make money. So they enslaved the natives and they forced them to work the land for their benefit. They made them grow crops that they could sell to other countries.
Food production in Puerto Rico has been the history of the destruction of our traditional eating habits in order to produce food that would be an export, a highly valued crop like coffee or sugar in the first half of the 20th century.
And you know how the story goes. When the natives died or escaped, they brought people from Africa and enslaved them and made them work the plantations. This hacienda in Caguas had about 30 slaves, and the hut where they were housed is still there, and so is the equipment that they were forced to use in unbearably hot temperatures. By the way, our African ancestors also influenced our diet. They brought us the plantain, which is a huge staple of Puerto Rican food, and it's what we use to make the famous mofongo. This is not working anymore. Fast forward to the end of the 19th... Oh, that scared the crap out of me. Okay. Hi, I'm so glad it's you and not another human. Come on. Okay, just a little intermission. So back to the story. You fast forward to the end of the 19th century and slavery had been abolished. But the desire to extract wealth from Puerto Rico's land was very much alive when the US took over. In fact, one of the reasons that Puerto Rico was so attractive to the US is because they wanted to expand their sugar market. And when they took over the island, they did just that.
We dried up hundreds of acres of marshes in order to have more land to grow sugar. And all that infrastructure needed extensive employees. I mean, lots of farming workers. So you had to take them off the other type of farms, the family farms. They were poor and they would work for whatever they were paid.
At this time, Puerto Ricans were living the Jíbaro life. Jíbaros were the people from the countryside who grew food to feed themselves and their families and sometimes to sell. They were the ones who became cheap labor for the sugar companies.
I must say that the United States kept most of the Puerto Rican population in a state of utmost poverty in order to provide cheap hand for their sugar industry.
In 1929, the sugar corporations reported $42 million in profit. At the time, the average wage of a cane worker was under $4 a week.
But even then, Puerto Rican families were still growing most of the food consumed locally. When things really took a turn was in the mid to late 1940s with Operation Bootstrap.
Puerto Rican government leaders called it Manos a la Obra. Put your hands to work.
That was a government effort to industrialize Puerto Rico and take it from having an economy based on agriculture to one based on manufacturing. This was supposed to lift Puerto Ricans out of poverty, so the idea was to attract U.S. corporations by offering them tax exemptions and, again, cheap labor.
We tried to convince the American investor that the Puerto Rican worker was basically a good worker.
This led to a wave of migration from the mountains to the city, and former farmers started taking factory jobs. Now there was a need to centralize the food supply, and that's when supermarkets came in. And processed and canned foods started pouring in and replacing native crops in the Puerto Rican diet. Doing away with the Jíbaro lifestyle was tangible in the sense that there were policies that incentivized that transition. But it was also psychological. If you're Puerto Rican, you know that word Jíbaro has a negative connotation. It's often used to describe someone who's uneducated or not sophisticated. But some young Puerto Ricans are seeing it differently.
Guava, guanábana.
They're returning to the land, partly out of need.
Yo dije, caramba, tengo que hacer algo. Por los nenes, por mí, yo no me puedo quedar sin hacer nada.
But also because they envision a different future for Puerto Rico.
We actually know that there's a whole other world that not only is possible, we are living in it.
Manolo is from La Perla, Puerto Rico.
This is Tara Rodriguez Besosa.
Mucho.
This is Tari Montalvo. Tari has 3 children, and she started growing food because she needed extra income.
Cuando yo cosecho el recao de una pequeña esquina de 32 libras que me salen, yo le saco $150. ¿Qué ustedes piensan? Aquí yo en mi casita con mis 3 hijos, 22 años.
But now it's really all she wants to do.
La tierra me llama. Ya tengo una conexión con ella que no me la quita nadie.
We've been working within agroecology and food sovereignty for almost like more than a decade now.
Dara studied architecture in New York, but moved back to Puerto Rico and bought a farm.
This is a really magical moment to be working within food because there are projects that are working within food sovereignty, that are practicing organic agriculture.
They both want Puerto Rico to stop relying on imports and supermarkets.
If most of our food is being imported, that means that most of the people here are eating imported, processed, shitty food. That means that most of the people here are not supporting themselves with local ingredients. And food sovereignty is meant for everybody. I think food sovereignty proposes that we can actually feed ourselves, that we can actually live on this land and own it.
¿Sabes lo lindo que sería eso de uno tener que salir y decir, voy un ejemplo, voy a casa de Juan y le voy a intercambiar unas calabazas por unas papayas? Eso sería algo bonito. Vamos a sembrar, vamos a tener los mismos productos que compramos en el supermercado, vamos a tenerlos nosotros y lo podemos lograr. Podemos de aquí mismo distribuir al mismo Puerto Rico, no tenemos que depender de afuera para recibir los alimentos.
And they're both working to help the agriculture movement grow.
Quiero llevarlo a todo el mundo, que sembremos.
Tati has her own business that she promotes on social media.
Y yo pensando qué nombre, yo dije, bueno, voy a ponerle Tari Recaíto y algo más. Me hicieron sticker, todo, y yo seguí pegándolo, donde quiera que iba los pegaba. Y seguí poco a poco. Lo subí a Facebook, lo subí a Instagram, no se cansen, porque aunque te compartan 2 veces, sé feliz, olvídate. Algún día te van a compartir 1000.
But she also started a garden at a senior center and wants to bring agriculture to schools.
Esto es oro. Esto es oro. De ahí salen grandes cosas.
Pitanga,
Tara grows food at home.
gandules.
And separately, she's part of an organization that supports other farmers with things like renting them equipment at a low cost.
Arar el terreno.
So remember I told you some people believed we have to go back to the ways of our indigenous ancestors of respecting nature and the land? Well, the kind of agriculture that both Tati and Tara support is one of small-scale farmers that grow a diversity of crops without pesticides.
Yo trabajo todo orgánico, yo no uso nada de químico porque eso es lo que nos vamos a comer.
We were seen as one huge farm, be it sugarcane, be it tobacco, be it coffee. When you think about these products, right, because they're products, they are not meant to feed people. Now there is an actual type of culture of food, not industry of food, not market of food, an actual culture of food. And agriculture does exist, and who makes agriculture in Puerto Rico are not your typical commercial plantation style farms that are exporting mangoes or working with genetically modified seeds. It's the small scale farms. It's your abuelita's backyard, it's your balcony, right?
Gracias a él, pues, tengo donde sembrar.
Meanwhile, the land that Tati's using right now to grow food belongs to a family friend, but she hopes to one day own land.
Mi sueño más grande es ahora tener un terreno para yo explotar todo este talento que yo sé que yo tengo. Ese es mi sueño, tener un terreno bien grande.
And Nelson Alvarez Febles, who you heard from before, proposes that Puerto Rico already has enough land to become food independent.
Legally, Puerto Rico has separated 1/4 of its territory for agriculture and food production. With that amount of land, doing ecological agriculture, I have figured out that Puerto Rico could feed 2/3 of its population, which would be food sovereignty and food security.
But that's on paper. The government did set aside that land to keep it from being urbanized, but some activists say that that's not always being respected and that that land is not being protected like it should be. But that's for another video. Thank you for watching this one. Tell me what you think, and I'll see you soon.